Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our live broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook Live and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Our topic tonight, writer Alice Walker first gave it a name, Colorism, discrimination based on skin color. In America and around the world, lighter skin is valued more than dark skin, a pernicious bias rooted in history and culture. As the nation moves closer to a multicultural majority, how is it that colorism still plagues communities of color? Joining me tonight, licensed psychologist and multicultural specialist, Dr. Darika Canada Cunningham, Jabari Asim, author of We Can't Breathe, and an associate professor at Emerson College. Lovely Hoffman, singer, actress, and educator. She wrote and sings My Black is Beautiful, a song about empowerment and embracing beauty. And Christina Duyon with the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture at Boston College. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Darika, I think I want to start with you about the history of colorism and how it got really to be as ingrained as it is in communities of color.
Yeah, when I think about colorism, I like to kind of call it the child of racism and classism. And so there's kind of the history within the United States when we think about colorism here, but we also know that colorism is global, and it's very related to colonialism and kind of the ways in which we have stratified kind of societies based off of class. Based off of social, certain features or social status. And so I think over time, we just see that same thing be portrayed and based off of skin color shade in particular. And colorism is very related to racism because if racism says white is right and classism says certain statuses are right, colorism says light is right. And so we just see it transmitted across generations in that way.
And so what we know is that this is something that has ripped apart families actually because the history of slavery is such that in our own families we can see different shades. In any given family it can be someone quite fair skinned and someone quite dark skinned, and that makes for people who have some biases around that. It comes to the fore. The sitcom, the ABC sitcom Blackish, just really did a great show about this recently. So I want to take a look and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Since when did you become dark-skinned?
I'm not dark, but I'm dark enough.
Not as dark as me.
Oh.
No one in this family is as dark as me. That's the problem.
That's not a problem. The fact that you're different is a good thing.
If it's so good, then why are you all so scared to talk about it? Like today, you're saying that it's about the camera lighting or complexion. No, it's about me being darker.
Well, it's a complicated issue, but Diane, all black skin is beautiful.
Well, we say that, but I don't know that it's internalized in that way. And by the way, that episode from Blackish, which is an ABC sitcom, really focused on Diane having her class picture taken and the lighting wasn't right for her. And this brought to the fore a conversation among her family members, as we can see there, who are different shades. Jabari, Hollywood seems to have played a part in this, as well as all media actually, but more recently we've been seeing a lot of examples of fairer skinned actors getting roles that would never go to darker skinned ones. So it's a cultural phenomenon.
Absolutely, and I think it also speaks to how insidious it is. The fact that we are all conscious, we're all aware that it's wrong, but we still have to resist it. And in Hollywood, even very recently when they did a feature film about a very famous rap group, the casting call specifically called for light-skinned actresses. So we're seeing that this, even though in this era, in theory at least, we know that that's not the move to make. But some of us are still comfortable expressing that kind of preference.
Now, we should say that we're having this conversation at a time when the nation is gripped with another color issue, which is blackface, which actually, I think, plays a part and connected with this, because you mentioned the racism, Derica. And that was a time in our history during minstrel shows when white men blackened their faces, and sometimes black men too. But the point is that black men made their skins darker and darker, and it couldn't just blacken your skin a little bit. You had to go all the way, Christina, to make the point that black people were less than, the characters, the stage performers did buffoonish sort of caricatures of what they thought black people were. That's passed down and been internalized, I think, that colorism that's connected to blackface in some way.
I would definitely agree, because we see these caricatures throughout media, and we even see it like in our social lives. So if we think about, I forget that show, it just escaped me, but I think it was JJ, like he was...
Oh, Good Times.
Good Times, thank you.
Yes.
So JJ, you know, he was this buffoon of a character, like he was always silly and jovial and wasn't intelligent, right? But if we think about it throughout time, like that character's always present, right? Like we're always mocking people of a darker skin, we're always using them as the outlet, right? That's right. And that continues.
Or the butt of the joke.
They are the butt of the joke, right? And even when you look at casting outside of that, you always see lighter skinned women, for example, portrayed like next to darker skinned men. Someone had pointed out to me that there was only one cartoon or one even show where there was a black family and the wife wasn't lighter, right? And if we think about it now, like, can you think of actually any cartoon or show where the wife isn't a little bit lighter than the husband? Because that is where the beauty standard is. And if the man is dark, or even if the woman is darker, she can't get a man, she's not attractive, she's loud, she's ignorant. So we still attribute these things to darker skin, whether we acknowledge it or not.
And to be clear, because we started off by making it clear that it's around the world. This is not completely seated in African American communities in the United States, for that matter, Latino communities or Asian communities. But yet, all around the world, skin bleaching is at a peak. $10 billion industry, because people are trying to make their skins lighter. White is still valued and preferred. This was so disturbing to you, Lovely, that you wrote a song about it for your students. First of all, tell me what was happening in the classroom that made you need to really address it more specifically?
Okay, so I've been teaching for over 15 years, and majority of the students that I teach are of African descent. So what I would often see is the kind of more overt ridiculing of darker skinned children, in which people would say things like, oh, blackie, African, black is African. But I will also see a lot of the more subtle ways in which black children, darker skinned females would feel insecure about themselves. For example, in schools, they have superlatives like best looking, most attractive. Oftentimes, you would also see, in terms of like social circles, like the lighter skinned children would be more accepted, you know. So I would often witness this in the classroom, and then it brought me back to when I was young and performing and growing up, and one teacher had said, well, Lovely doesn't have the looks to be a singer. And I just remember how horrible it made me feel. I think we live in a society, in terms of Western society, where sameness is valued and uniqueness is devalued. So when we look at like differences, people think of it as a deficit, but it's actually an asset, especially in African culture. So I wanted to do something about it, and so I went and wrote this song called My Black is Beautiful.
Okay, we're gonna listen to it. Let's take a listen to it so we can see what you did.
Thank you.
Look at her face, look at her skin. It's either too dark or it's too light. Her complexion's not right, but it's all a part of me. Who are you to say that I'm not beautiful?
There you go. That's beautiful.
Yes.
I think that young kids this age particularly, are not only influenced by the images that are out there, but we also have social media, which is also, it was already there. Let's be clear. This was already a part of our conversation, even if it wasn't always publicly stated. But now there are many other avenues for these images and the kind of biases that go along with them to be out and more present in everybody's lives, and I think it's particularly damaging for young children.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because I'm just following up with your point. I think like when we look at celebrities, whenever they say something, like a lot of people like really adhere to what they say because they have so much influence. So just thinking about like the casting call, I think it was Kanye West, in which he said
He
the
wanted
casting call,
multicultural.
multicultural women, or like looking at people like Leslie Jones from Saturday Night Live. Like her Twitter account was hacked and people were saying she looks like a gorilla, you know, or like just various instances in which you see women of darker hues just not being respected or people not valuing in the way they look. So like this all trickles down to like our children, because like the media controls so much of the minds of, you know, of our children, because, you know, they're very impressionable at a young age. So it's really important that like when we look at the media that it represents our children, and that's not the case.
Well, the pain of this, the psychological damage, of course, you two can speak about very well. But I want to make a point before we talk about some of that really significant pain about economics, Jabari, because it turns out that studies have shown that it really comes down to pocketbook issues as well, that the choices are being made that lighter skinned people get better jobs, likely to have a better living situation. I mean, at every measure that would improve your life from an economic standpoint, darker skinned people, these are studies. I'm not just making this up. It really makes a difference.
Right. Also, I might suggest that we expand beyond commerce and look at politics.
Yes.
For example, 2 African Americans have declared for their candidacies for president. Coincidentally, both are biracial. The successful candidate we've had was also biracial. So if we look at the traditional leadership in civil rights organizations, for example, it's often skewed, not completely, but certainly skewed in favor of lighter skinned people. So it pervades nearly every aspect of African American existence, unfortunately.
So the pain of this is, from a psychological standpoint, it's deep, because it's not something you can get rid of. I'm looking at social media and seeing people team dark skin, team light skin. This is today's language. I mean, I can say personally that my mother was quite fair and my dad was dark, and I never thought about it. My mother's Louisiana Creole country, real Creoles, not made up Creoles. Some people say they are, but they're not. Okay. And my father was quite dark, but I never thought about it until I went to 6th grade, and someone said to me, this is a white kid, why is your dad, why are they different colors? And I thought, we hadn't really talked about it. But so what do we do with something that is so ingrained and embedded, Derica?
Well, I think someone mentioned it earlier. Having awareness is kind of the first step, because if you aren't aware and you don't acknowledge, and I think this came up in the episode of Blackish, I think they kind of came to the point that the ways in which our families and our communities kind of center around this secret of shame and we don't really talk about it. I think that is kind of a first step to healing for a lot of people. So acknowledging, becoming more aware of it, and checking yourselves. I've spoken to youth before about this topic and talked about, you know, being able to call yourself out when you laugh at that joke, or when you retweet that meme. And it can be hard, because some things, and I think on Blackish as well, they mentioned this, that it's just jokes, but it's not just jokes.
Right.
And so when you laugh, when you retweet, you actually perpetuate colorism. So in some ways, being able to call yourself out and check your own internalized kind of colorism ideology. And I think also there are resources for healing as well. I mean, I think therapy and counseling can be helpful, but also community ways in which people heal can also be useful.
I also like to make the point that within just European communities, if we're going to put it like that, there's also a preference for blonde and blue eyes.
Sure.
So even within the context of where one would be already light, presumably, there are gradations still. So that's how deep colorism is embedded. But speaking of the pain, since we're now starting to have these conversations publicly, Bill Duke did a film called Dark Girls, in which he really just allowed people to talk about what it has meant to them from a painful experience. So let's take a look.
I can remember being in the bathtub asking my mom to put bleach in the water so that my skin would be lighter.
This is not just a U.S. phenomenon.
One of the most popular products in the third world is skin whitening cream.
My mother, she's bragging on me. She said, my daughter is beautiful. And then she adds, could you imagine if she had any lightness in her skin at all? She'd be gorgeous.
So given that, and then given Black Panther, the cast of Black Panther, which was overwhelmingly dark-skinned actors, this was quite a phenomenon and made a statement, which a lot of people noticed, by the way.
Well, can I add to that too?
Yes.
Because I kind of think that sometimes when you do see an all-black majority cast that's of darker hue, a lot of times they represent like kind of the exotic, like in my opinion. Like Black Panther was really powerful, but that's one thing I noticed. And then when you look at like The Walking Dead, the sister Denai Guerrera, again, so it's like kind of the exotic. Like it's not necessarily the like
every day.
Every day.
Interesting. I
That's
hadn't
one
observed
observation that I kind of like.
I feel like that plays into this idea of like, you know, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl.
Absolutely.
Like if there's gonna be a cast of dark-skinned people making statements and we just wanna be like, wow, this is beautiful and amazing, we're like, but they're an exception. These are acceptable dark-skinned people in their lane, in their continent.
Yes.
Right? But do not be under the impression that this will be mainstream.
Exactly.
Right? So I could see what you're saying about this exoticism because there isn't this idea where like, now this is gonna be the staple.
Yeah.
It's not the staple. We rise these 2 or 3 dark-skinned women to the forefront.
That's right.
Like, look, we care about all hues of Black people. But will there be others? Like, how many more years must we wait for like there to be another wave? And so at the end of the day, I'm thinking about the casting for like that Motown tribute. They gave it to J-Lo, right? So it's
That's
still
new controversy.
new controversy.
But I think a lot of times we have to go like behind the camera, behind the script, and look at who's making these decisions, right? And I would push back a little bit and say that I think culture is probably the best way to resist this through art. And I think Lovely's song is a really good example of that by resisting through art. I think you do quite a bit
Thank you.
that way.
I also question if it's just a trend too, right? Because it's like right now the whole blackness is a trend. Like a lot of like if you look at 5 years ago, you were not seeing people as like so determined to share their blackness with the world. You see there's a wave of this now, whether we're talking about Solange's Don't Touch My Hair. Kelly Rowland just came out with a song called My Crown. Like these are artists that's been around for a long time, and now they're actually expressing themselves, which is a good thing, but then it's like, okay, is this just a trend?
Well, let me put that on the table because in the 60s there was a period of Black is Beautiful, which was very much accepted,
And in the
people
90s
embraced that, and then that sort of faded away. But I thought in the last sort of 5-10 years there have been people saying, I'm going back to my natural hair, I'm embracing that. So is that not a reviving of that?
I think it's even longer than that because if you look, let's look at children's books, for example. I Love My Hair by Natasha Tarpley. It's been out for 20 years. Happy to Be Nappy by Carol Olivia Heron has been out for 20 years. So there's always been some people in the culture, I guess the literary equivalent of what you did with your song, you know, kind of pushing back by, you know, creating culture that pushes this idea that we can embrace who we actually are.
But when it comes to, I was going to say, when it comes to pop culture, there are kind of these waves because the 90s was another period where I think we were very pro-Black and embracing a lot of our culture. And even in doing the research on colorism, I remember when I started my dissertation back in maybe 2012, there weren't a lot of people talking about it then. And I remember really being excited that we're having these conversations again. And I've seen just the increase in conversations around it, even just over kind of the past, 5 to 7 years.
But are you impressed that the conversations we're having now are positive, or are we just sort of having conversations? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are positive, and in working with college students, I see even youth and young adult kind of having these conversations and really having that critical awareness around it. It feels positive, but like you mentioned, I wonder if it's going to be persistent, and if it's going to be pervasive, and kind of continue beyond kind of right now, what feels maybe popular to be kind of woke about or talking about.
I also feel like right now, like the current, like My Black is Beautiful, everyone returning to natural. I feel like there's an undercurrent there of like what type of Black is beautiful. And I remember, because I've always been natural, but I've always like had the privilege of having hair that looked like this, so people kind of let me go about it, right? But as the wave came through, the goal was to get everyone's hair to look like mine, right? So everyone is committed to a twist out. Everyone's trying to get their hair to look a certain type of natural. It's not the 60s version of like, as it grows out of your hair, it works. It's how do you manipulate it to look like some type of mixed curly?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? So I feel like the Black is Beautiful wave right now, there's something under that's not, that's still not including everyone in the picture. Because if you have like 4C hair, we're not talking about you, right? Because the goal is to get you to get your hair to look a different type of way, not the way it grows out of your head.
How do we move from the original separation of the enslaved on the plantation. I mean, we are still living with that. Where for folks who don't know, the dark-skinned enslaved persons had to be in the field and pick the cotton. And the ones who were lighter skinned, who were products of rape by the masters often, and of one of the enslaved women, worked in the house because they were closer to white. So, I mean, that's a foundation that feels so many times like it's unshakable. That whatever happens, you end up coming back to that.
It's generational trauma really, at the core of it.
And I feel like the intergenerational trauma, it persists in ways that we don't always talk about. Like in the Blackish episode, they mentioned, oh, we don't ever bring it up. It's not a thing. We've never made you feel different. And I think about all the ways that family members say things that stick with you. I remember having a friend, and I was like, hey, let's go to the beach. And she's like, I'm just trying to stay out of the sun. And I was like, why? And I started listening, and a lot of my Black girlfriends were like, I'm just not trying to be in the sun. Or like, we have to get an umbrella. And I'm like, why do we have to get an umbrella? Like, but this isn't nothing. Like, these statements don't mean nothing, Like, if you hear them throughout your life enough, you're hearing that getting darker is a bad thing, that you have to avoid it. Because no one's saying don't get skin cancer, right? Like, no one is saying that.
Well, I want to add to that, too, because, like, when looking at the episode, they stated that, like, no one wants to talk about it, but some families don't really understand it and know it exists as well. So the assumption is that everyone knows that it exists, but no one's talking about it, but that's not true. Me growing up with my family, a lot of my great aunt, like, she only had like a 5th grade education, but the things that she would say was very hurtful. She didn't know she was saying it. And to kind of delve into it and get deep and talk about slavery and colonization could have kind of been a bit much. So a lot of it is just people not really knowing, people not really being aware. One of the things I did is I actually wrote a curriculum that actually goes along with the song, so schools could use it, and it's like 2 weeks long to kind of like help educate.
To deconstruct it.
To deconstruct it, right, and to kind of assist with, this is not just a song, but like, let's unpack what's being said, let's dig deep. Because I think when students really learn about what's happening and they are informed, then they can stop, they cannot perpetuate that ignorance.
So Jabari, in your classroom, because you're dealing with images and stories that would hit on all of these themes, presumably, have you seen any change in the students in understanding of this or how they approach it?
I think there are parallels in literary development in terms of all these other areas that we're talking about. So a lot of the issues that are important to us on social media and in conversation are manifesting themselves in the literature as well. But one of the things we have to look at even is that language among those of us who consider ourselves aware. For example, when we describe dark-skinned people, we describe them as dark-skinned people. When we talk about light-skinned people, we describe them as fair-skinned. And the dictionary definition of that, of course, is beautiful, right? So we're kind of imposing a judgment that's coming from outside of our community that really is anti-Black racism, even when we're discussing it, right? So we kind of have to always push back.
Well, I recall that in the 60s, there was also, fair-skinned people.
There we go.
People on the lighter end of the skin who felt, wait a minute, I'm Black. Don't try to, act like I'm not Black. I'm not passing. That was part of it. People don't understand that history of people that were so fair as that they could pass. And there are plenty of them still doing it today. To get outside of this very hurtful phenomenon of being judged by your community and also being judged outside of your community when it manifests itself as racism in a different kind of form. So it's a really tough nut to crack, particularly when you see the sharpness of how it strikes at any moment. As you say, it just pop up any moment, and you're like, wait a minute, where'd that come from? Dorica, what are you saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, that came up in the show Blackish as well, when the mom had that very defensive reaction to, I'm Black, even though I'm light-skinned, to the grandmother. And I think that actually is true. I think another thing to kind of call out and acknowledge is that we've talked about it only in the direction of it affecting darker-skinned women. But what I know, and even in my research study, lighter-skinned women actually say, this affects me, this hurts me, this just as
Yes.
difficult. They have their racial legitimacy questioned because of their skin color. And the thing about colorism and skin color shade is that it's so contextual. I talk all the time about how being a young black girl growing up in Kentucky and moving to Boston, that my skin color literally changed because there's not enough sun here. And then people perceive it differently. So you have what you perceive as your own skin color, and then you have what other people's perceive you as. And sometimes there's a little conflict with that, and that doesn't maybe kind of match. And so I think that can cause a lot of difficulty for people as well.
Quickly, is talking about it good?
I'd say absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Really? Even if it's hurtful, and we're getting some of this stuff out on the table, it's still
Hurtful but necessary, I would
It
say.
validates experiences.
Yeah.
And you need to know that what you're experiencing is real. Because if everyone's constantly saying, no, it's in your head, you're exaggerating, you will drive yourself crazy.
Okay. Well, that's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. And I want to thank all of you for being here for the first part of this conversation. But stay with us right now as we continue our conversation on Facebook Live and Twitter about colorism and its impact.
Lord, in the memory of all the saints who from their labors rest, and in the joy of a new beginning, we ask you to help us work for that day when black will not be asked to get back, when brown can stick around, when yellow will be mellow, when the red man can get ahead, man, and when white will embrace what is right. Let all those who do justice and love mercy say amen. Amen. Say amen, and amen.
That was civil rights activist and minister Dr. Joseph Lowery in 2009 at the end of the benediction for President Barack Obama's first term in office, putting his interpretation of blues singer Big Bill Bronzy's song, Black, Brown, and White. We are on Facebook Live and Twitter with our post-show, continuing our discussion about colorism. And I want to, as we go on, talk about this poll that Basic Black took on both Facebook and Twitter. The Facebook poll, the question was, does skin complexion matter? Facebook poll, 43% yes, 57% no. Twitter poll, 33% yes, 50% no, 17% depends. So there you have it. So, you know, the statement that Reverend Lowery made, that really is colorism in a cultural manifestation that we know about, so that we've heard that statement many times before, but not usually in that setting. There are two questions. One is about, what do we say about black men who continue to perpetuate the colorism phenomenon by choosing lighter-skinned women, and how do we change the narrative for black boys, therefore?
A part of that narrative has to include a redefinition of what's attractive, of what's appealing, right? And I think that has to happen. And there has to be active resistance. And one way that that's happening actually is through films like Black Panther, or you know, other films in which a woman who is blessed with a generous helping of melanin
Yes.
is presented as beautiful, as desirable. And there's always some kind of disconnect, I think, sometimes between the popular culture and the communities in which we live. I mean, I grew up in an all-black, traditionally all-black community, and I did see that kind of colorism. On the other hand, I saw plenty of women who were dark-skinned who were actually presented as beautiful, as desirable.
I think the thing about Black Panther, too, if I may say, is that the assumption is that the dark-skinned women are pretty. Not only that they are just presented.
Sure.
That's just the assumption in the film.
Yeah.
So you enter into it. You enter into that universe. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. What do y'all have to say about the narrative for Black boys?
I was going to say, I think it's one thing to say I'm attracted to this or I have this preference, but when people say I don't date X, I won't date Y, that's when it kind of leans into like discrimination, when you will not kind of date a particular person. I remember growing up, I had a guy tell me he wouldn't date girls that were darker than him. He only dated girls that were his color or lighter. And I think about that impact on me as a young teen girl. So there is some differentiation because people have preferences of many kind. But like you said, like what's beneath it, and it goes back to this sense of awareness. Have you thought about why you have that preference?
Sure.
Are you aware of that and conscious of that? And I think that's really important too.
I would add to that, like interrogating yourself and friends. So if you hear your friends say these things, if you feel like you feel these things, asking yourself, like, where did this come from and why? Like, what is perpetuating this, and do I actually want to be a part of this? How am I complicit in it, and do I want to continue to be complicit in it?
And I also wonder, like, in terms of like education, like that's why it's so important. Character education is so important. Culture education is so important because first and foremost, we have to make sure we're teaching our children like tolerance in school. But secondly, I feel like just to to divert to another point, darker children in school, I feel like a lot of times they're perceived by teachers and by their peers as being aggressive and defiant. And I think maybe some of these young Black men and Black females, darker females, may be mistreated based off the fact that they are of a darker hue.
Well, you don't have to wonder. They are. The studies say.
Right.
Yes.
The research shows that. So a lot of them may not want to. They have negative associations themselves or negative experiences with being dark, and therefore may not want to have children who they feel may experience those same, have those negative experiences. Because I remember growing up and family members saying things like, "Oh, I want to date or marry a lighter skinned person because I want my children to be lighter skinned." And maybe and a lot of it was darker people who had negative experiences with being dark. To be honest.
Yes.
And also with regard to Black men, we also know that the studies show that darker skinned men are likely to be perceived as threatening. And when we think about the shootings of unarmed Black men, pretty much that goes down, well, he was hulking or he was so, because I think back to Michael Brown, and he and the officer who shot him were the same size.
Right.
But the description of him was like he was, the Black Hulk or something. Because that's the perception in the mind of people. Now, I just wanted to say to you that at one point in my life, I had an interesting situation, which I didn't really deconstruct very, very well at the time, but it's just coming back to me. But I had a guy who was quite fair-skinned, who only dated brown women, which became, I caught on to that after a while, but I thought, this is interesting. And, when I finally caught on to it, I said, what's going on here? He said, yep, that's my preference. Okay, but there's something underneath there. I just thought, wow.
There's something that brings these things forth and that has to ask you, how did I get here? I remember you had mentioned that your mother was a Creole. I lived in Louisiana for a little while, and my cousin, who was much fairer than I, were at a bar, and a Creole gentleman kind of walked up to us because he thought that she was Creole. And we mentioned that, no, we're Haitian, etc. And we just started asking about the culture. We're like, we've heard about these group of people. Like, what are you guys about? And he mentioned that he could only bring home a Creole girl. So he could bring my cousin home, and although I was light, I wasn't light enough. I couldn't pass as a Creole, so I'm cute, but it wouldn't work out. And I was like, this is remarkable that there's such a commitment to this, that even if you were to consider, he could never bring home someone who wasn't Creole or didn't pass for Creole.
Well, I think if we go back all the way to the 20s, the paper bag test was really, Louisiana was a hotbed for that.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating because, as you all know, it's kind of a polyglot of so many different ethnicities and so much mixing, including in my family and on my mother's side, Native American. So that you have that mix, you have Spanish, you have the French, you know, you had Africans. I mean, it's a big, you would think this should be the home of multiculturalism, and yet it is not. And to my knowledge, never was. So that's how deeply embedded it was. But of course, and let me take that back, because when the French came, they were very, very particular about, in fact, there is a musical. Have you ever heard of Once on This Island?
I love Once on This Island.
Once on This Island is beautiful. The main characters are a darker skinned young woman who's in a different caste totally. Accidental meeting of someone from the landed gentry who is black but fair skinned. And then the tragic unraveling of their story. And then they tell the history and talk about colorism. It's very deep. It's a beautiful story.
It's on Broadway right now.
Yeah, yeah. So if you haven't seen it, it is on Broadway.
And so that's like a Haitian story, but interesting. Also interesting is a Latina story, like Amara Negra.
Yes.
She is like, I think she is from Dominican Republic, I believe.
Right.
But darker skinned sister, beautiful sister. But a lot of people are questioning whether or not she's really Dominican.
Right.
And some people have even said that she's actually in blackface because they don't believe that she is of African descent. And the issue is that a lot of people don't know the history, because when they think of African Americans, they think, oh, they were, descendants of slaves, enslaved Africans, but they don't understand that like slavery extends well beyond
the
United States. But Brazil has the
largest
largest population, which they have their own issue in terms of like the color caste system.
Sure.
Absolutely.
So I think that's actually really interesting, because a lot of times when you look at Latinas women, a lot of women, you think of the Jennifer Lopez, the Selenas, they're usually lighter skin, and you don't see the darkest skin.
And they
sisters.
look like all types of people. Like the Latinx community goes from the whitest white to the darkest dark.
Exactly.
And actually, I have a friend who's Dominican, and she was making a remark to me that she would hear her family say, it's a saying in Spanish, so I won't pretend to try to say it, but it basically meant to better the race, right?
Yeah.
And better the race meant to lighten the race.
Yes.
And when you grow up hearing those things, it's going to impact you. Even if everyone's like, oh no, just we want things to be better for you, better for your kids. You want to move the culture whiter. You want to make everyone whiter because you think that's better.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. The messaging that comes across in parenting and families is just so relevant. And even when it's not even just what they say, it's what they don't say. And it's what they do. So if you grew up seeing your parent act a certain way toward people of a certain skin color shade or stating their own preferences, you can internalize that and you can take those beliefs as your own. And so I think that messaging definitely has that effect.
And I'll point out that the similar conversation is taking place around the film Crazy Rich Asians.
I was going to bring that up. Yes.
Right. About the few darker skinned Asians in the film are the servants.
Right. Well, not just the servants, but I did a piece on my radio show about this with some Asian American cultural critics, and they pointed out that when Awkwafina and Constance Wu, I can't remember her character's name right at the moment, drive up to the mansion to meet the family and everything. The people that stop them outside are dark and menacing. And they've written quite a bit about how they find that very distressing. That's the way to go. The Facebook question is, why is it that a lighter skinned person can't intervene or interrupt this conversation as it's going to, as they happen and kind of turn it? Is there a way to do that? And I just wanted to bring this up. There is some dispute about this, I will say, but I did hear, and you all probably heard too, that Amanda Steinberg, who is biracial, turned down, or she got very close to getting a role in Black Panther and stepped back and said, that's not appropriate for me. She obviously is quite fair, and some dispute that. But the point is, there was some discussion about that, as opposed to Zoe Saldana, who took on the role of Nina Simone, and she is biracial. And Nina Simone, part of who she was as a dark-skinned woman, and dealing with that as she lived her life, and she darkened her face and put on prosthetic nose. So anyway, the question is, intervening, interrupting coming from the initiative of a light-skinned person. What do y'all?
Like, can they or should they?
Can or should, yes. And does that have more impact, in other words? So if you know, without changing the narrative, what is attractive, that every man in the room is going to find the light-skinned woman attractive, can she say, well, wait a minute, I don't know. I'm asking the question. That's the Facebook question.
I think that...
Or is that positive? Maybe that's not their role. Maybe,
I mean, I think that this theoretical lighter skinned person has a role. I was talking to a friend about this actually right before I came here. And I said the position of power is going to rely on the person who has the most power in that space. So if we want to talk about racism, we want to get moving, we need white people in those spaces to propel the conversation because they have more power in that space. So if you want to talk about colorism, you need lighter skinned people in those conversations to also propel that forward, right? So do they have a space and a voice? Yes. What are they saying? Still thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, what more do they need to do beyond acknowledge light skin privilege?
Yeah,
right? I mean, yeah, it doesn't seem entirely.
Well, one could say, I'm just thinking of this now in this moment. Well, daggone it, I'm black. Why I gotta be defending my blackness?
It's quite a bit to ask, I think.
Yeah.
Right, because it's an accident of genetics
that
they are who they are. So.
Which is same with race, and I think it is really complex, because I think what the person is kind of relating this to is when we talk about white individuals sharing power and kind of really acknowledging their privilege and in some way risking and handing over their privilege in situations. So I guess in this case, they're talking about a light-skinned person handing over their privilege like the actress did. But it is complex because, like you said, an individual also still has these other experiences, is still a black individual or a person of color. So it is very complicated.
And Amanda, to be clear, is biracial. So is that different from fair-skinned person with two fair-skinned parents? Or, two black parents.
I tend to think that people have the right to self-identify, and that if a person's biracial and they choose to identify as black, that makes sense to me. That's their choice.
Okay. Well, I don't know if we're going to solve this problem, but you all said it's important to have these kinds of conversations. I guess you said it was important to have them, so I guess my last question would be, are we having them in a more productive and expansive way now? I mean, Blackish was very interesting in the way that I thought that's a mainstream show, couldn't be more mainstream, has a very millions in the audience. It'll be played again and again. The writing is fabulous, and it really addressed it. People should watch the whole episode. But that's one piece of art and one time and space. And how does that reverberate?
I think there's room for so much more of that. I think, and I think we have to look at it in terms of multiple categories of art. So we've got television, we've got film, we've got music. So we've got different artists approaching it from different angles, probably more than ever before, since like the Harlem Renaissance or the Black Arts Movement in the 60s, maybe. But that said, there's room for so much more.
And I think like many topics similar to colorism, colorism is complex, it's dynamic, it's pervasive. And so these conversations are ongoing. You don't reach an expert level or a certain intellect around this. It's something we have to continue to have. And how we have it in 10 years might look very different than how we're having it right now. And that's okay, because it will evolve, just like other conversations have as well.
Sure. Is colorism still the right word when we talk about this?
I don't have a better one.
Well, there's shadeism,
skin bias.
Yeah. I don't know if those are better. Those are just different.
Malcolm X says self-hate, but I guess that's more than just colorism.
Yeah, I think it's more nuanced.
It's a symptom of it. Yeah.
I think that word works for now.
Yeah.
But I think even if we were to give it different words, it doesn't change the experience.
Right.
And I think sometimes we get caught up in the nomenclature of things like, no, it's this. But the experience of it is still going to exist for all groups of color. So I think addressing it in our communities. I'm really big on like conversations with your friends and family. Like bring it home, talk about it over dinner, just see what's going on in your house and what are you perpetuating and what are you not. And regardless of what you call it, because each culture has their own language and terms around it, if you can just figure out what is happening for you, I think that will be the great start to the conversation.
I think I'm also optimistic that because we now have like the internet and a lot of people have control over the messaging, like it's not necessarily just controlled by like a few entities. You can look on YouTube, you can see Facebook, like right now we're live, right? And we can continue this conversation. People have more control over the messaging, so hopefully like people can look to the internet and different things for you know, to learn more about it.
I just hope it gets bigger, because I think about Amara La Negra, right? And she was on the Breakfast Club. And as she's talking about her experiences, Charlemagne is denying them left and right.
Wow.
Like throughout the episode, basically. And he's just he's saying that everything she's saying isn't true. And he gives these random off examples of like, here are like dark-skinned women who have done something, like your experience isn't valid. And you can sense her frustration throughout the episode. But, you know, the Breakfast Club's platform,
well, he calls
massive.
And he calls DJ MB Beige, and it's just like,
yes, he calls him beige constantly.
Right? Continue to perpetuate this idea that it's just.
Well, in some ways, invalidating is a defense mechanism. Making a joke out of it in that moment is a defense mechanism for something that's very uncomfortable for somebody. So I think the more we talk about it, the more people might become comfortable with the discomfort, and I think that will really propel the conversation forward.
60-year-old woman just wrote in and said she's light-skinned and she's had to deal with a lot of this still, and it's been a long journey.
I believe that, because you're still black.
In America.
You're still black in America.
And it's just been going on for so long. That's why I'm just kind of like, okay, you know.
Yeah, I mean, my mother will be 88 this year. She went to a historically black college, and she still talks about being excluded because of the paper bag test from consideration from a certain sorority. And it's been 70 years. So the wounds fester and the pain resonates.
Yeah, because if we're all coping with the general racism, and we all are, I don't care how privileged you may think you are, at some point that comes home to you, and you realize, hey, you're in the community. That's hard. I don't even have a word for it, but that's really hard. Well, I thank you all for talking to me tonight about this, and I'm sure we'll be picking it up again at some other point. But thank you. Okay. All right.